All right, everyone, get ready for this. Today, we are diving into a topic that's always kind of floating around out there, always feels relevant, always a little, honestly, complex to really wrap your head around. Discrimination.
It's a big one.
It is a big one. And,
Yeah.
I've got this stack of economic research papers on the topic that you sent over. And I'll be honest, my brain is already doing like backflips trying to think about how to synthesize all of this.
Mhm.
So you're my official brain trust today, helping us unpack all of this.
Happy to be here. And, we're not going about this trying to point fingers or play the blame game.
No, no, no.
Think of it this way. We're looking at discrimination, if you can even put it in a box like that, through an economist's lens.
Okay.
How do people make choices, especially when they don't have all the information? And how can those choices, even with the best of intentions, how do those choices sometimes lead to, well, let's just say, not so great outcomes for everyone?
Exactly. It's like looking at the mechanics, the gears and sprockets of the
Uh,
system itself.
yeah.
It's not about being like, oh, you're a bad person, you're a bad person.
Right.
It's about saying, okay, how does this thing actually work? So first things first, what are we even talking about when we say discrimination, like in this context? One of the papers actually gets super specific, defining it as, and I'm going to quote this here, differential treatment of agents that are inherently equal.
And that's a really critical starting point because we're not talking about those instances where, differences in treatment are like totally justified.
Totally.
Like if someone with a decade of experience gets a job over, say, a recent grad,
Uh-huh.
well, that's not really what we're digging into here.
Right, right, of course. Yeah.
This is about those situations where people are treated differently based on something, solely based on their identity, not on their actual qualifications or merit, just who they are.
Okay, so to use their example,
Yeah.
let's say we've got two people applying for the same job, they have the same skills, the same qualifications, everything. But one gets a worse offer,
Right.
or even just flat out rejected.
Right.
And the only difference is something like their race, gender, religion, whatever. That's what we're trying to kind of like unravel here.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And these economic models, they're really trying to get at the why, the how of that kind of thing happening. And one of the big ones, a classic really, that comes up is something called Phelpsian statistical discrimination.
Whoa, okay. It's giving econ textbook flashbacks over here a little bit.
It's a mouthful, right?
It's a mouthful. But you know what? Knowledge is power. So lay it on me. What is that?
All right, so it boils down to this. Employers, they don't always have a crystal ball, right?
Right.
They don't always have perfect information about every single person who applies for a job.
Who does, really?
Exactly, and nobody does.
Ah.
So because of that, they might, without realizing it, use group membership as, well, kind of a shortcut.
Okay, so like, if an employer has this idea, again, maybe they're totally aware of it, maybe it's completely unconscious, but the idea is people from this background are less likely to have this skill, so they might be hesitant to hire from that group, even if the person standing right in front of them is totally, completely qualified.
You got it. And the key here is the model isn't saying, all employers are actively prejudiced.
Right.
It's about this idea of having to make a decision with limited info. It's like, imagine hiring someone without even glancing at their resume first.
Okay, yeah.
You'd probably, even without realizing it, lean on some stereotypes.
That is a really good point. And that's something we do in all areas of life, right? Not just hiring. It's choosing a school, swiping on a dating app, all of it.
And all the time.
We're making these snap judgments constantly, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. But here's where it gets, I think, even more interesting. There's another paper we have. This one by Chambers and Echenique came out in 2021, and they really dug into how the way information is presented, even just the way it's presented, can influence this whole discrimination thing. They call it, and I love this term, information design.
Okay. Now that feels very relevant to our world of like, algorithms and curated online profiles and all of that.
Oh, absolutely. Like what they found is that even small things, how a resume is designed, what someone chooses to emphasize on their dating profile, these things can make the statistical discrimination we've been talking about even worse, or they can actually make it better.
So it's not just about the information itself. It's about how it's packaged,
Right.
how it's presented to the world. It makes you wonder, what are we all revealing and what are we hiding, even unintentionally, that's changing how other people see us?
It's a good question.
It's like that whole thing. You hear stories about people sending out identical resumes but with different names on them
Yeah.
and getting wildly different responses. Like, that's information design right there, just kind of inaction.
Exactly. And that's just one example. There are so many ways that the way information is presented, or even just, what information is available to begin with, it can have a huge impact.
Okay, so this is already making me rethink my LinkedIn profile, not going to lie.
Right.
But didn't this research also kind of go into this idea that discrimination, even if it's based on totally bogus assumptions, can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy?
You're thinking of Coate and Lowry's work from back in '93.
Yes.
And yeah, they really went deep on this idea.
Okay, so what'd they find? Give me the details.
Basically, they found that if you start with discrimination, even if the assumptions it's based on are completely 100% inaccurate, it can actually create this situation where, down the line, people end up making choices that confirm those original assumptions, even if they would never have made those choices otherwise.
Whoa. That's kind of heavy. Give me an example. Like, how does that play out in the real world?
Okay, let's say there's this idea out there that people from a certain group are just less likely to be interested in higher education.
Okay.
So employers, they hear this and they start offering lower paying jobs to people from this group.
Right.
Because in their minds, they're like, well, they probably wouldn't have the fancy degrees anyway.
Right. They're assuming.
Assuming, exactly.
But the thing is, that assumption then makes it less appealing and honestly less financially possible
Oh, for sure.
for people in that group to even pursue higher education in the first place, even if they're perfectly capable of, like, talk about a vicious cycle.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Coate and Lowry were really highlighting. How these seemingly small, even rational decisions that people make based on these totally inaccurate assumptions, they can snowball into these huge long-term consequences. It's crazy.
It's wild. And it's not just about those self-fulfilling prophecies, right?
Yeah.
Didn't you say something about perpetual underestimation? Now there's a phrase you don't hear every day.
It's a good one, though, right?
Okay.
I mean, it really gets at this idea that if we always go with the safe bet, the known quantity, we kind of close ourselves off.
Interesting.
We miss out on the chance to learn about other groups, other ways of thinking, other possibilities. We kind of get stuck in these echo chambers, and we miss out on all this potential.
Oh, totally. It's like if you go to your favorite restaurant and you order the same dish every single time, you might miss out on finding your new favorite thing on the menu. Right?
Exactly. You got to branch out, be open to something new. Think about industries that have historically been dominated by one particular group.
Right.
Breaking that cycle, bringing in people with different backgrounds, experiences. It's not just about being fair. It's about, it's about innovation. It's about growth for everyone.
100%. Okay. So this is already blowing my mind a little bit, but we're not done, are we? There was something else in this research. This is where it gets into, like, how our brains are even wired, right? There was this whole thing about rational inattention.
Ah, yes. This is a good one because it gets at the fact that we all have these, limitations. Our own brains can trip us up even when we're trying our best to be totally rational.
Okay. Intrigue level. High GH. Tell me everything.
All right. So rational inattention, big phrase, but it basically means we can only pay attention to so much at once. Makes sense, right? Our brains have limited bandwidth.
Yeah. Otherwise, we'd be totally overwhelmed constantly.
Exactly. So we have to prioritize. We naturally gravitate toward whatever seems most relevant or most important in that moment.
Which, on the face of it, seems fine. Right. Like, that makes sense. We'd be paralyzed if we tried to process every single little thing all the time. But how does that tie back into, this whole discrimination conversation?
So think about it this way. When we're up against a ton of information, we use mental shortcuts.
Right.
We categorize things. We make these little assumptions, all to try and be more efficient.
Yeah.
But when we apply those same shortcuts to people, to entire groups of people, that's where we can get into trouble.
Okay. So it's not necessarily about people being intentionally ignorant or, choosing to ignore information. It's just that our brains are trying to simplify, and sometimes that simplification has a cost.
Exactly. And again, this isn't just, some abstract theory. Bartu, Bauer, Chidalova, and Matejka, they did this really interesting study back in 2016. And they actually found that employers may scrutinize applications from certain groups way more closely, which you think, okay, more attention, that's good, right? But they found it actually led to more rejections.
Wait, so more attention is actually a bad thing in this case?
Right.
How does that even work?
It's all about where that attention is going, If you're looking for a reason to reject someone, you're probably going to find something, even if it's something tiny, something that wouldn't have mattered for someone else. It's like that saying, if you're looking for faults, you'll find them everywhere.
Wow. Yeah. Okay, that is seriously kind of mind-bending.
Yeah.
Because it really highlights how even when people have the best intentions, even if they're not consciously trying to discriminate, they can still end up playing a part in these cycles without even realizing it.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases, these mental shortcuts we all rely on, because once you see them, you can start to, you can start to challenge them in yourself and in the systems around you.
Totally. Honestly, this has been one aha moment after another, but we've got to keep in mind we're looking at this through a very specific lens,
Right,
right?
right.
We're looking at this through the lens of economics, but obviously there are other perspectives to consider, other really crucial pieces to this whole puzzle.
Oh, absolutely. You can't separate this stuff from the larger social context. And, the research you shared, it also went into these concepts like institutional discrimination, structural discrimination, even institutional racism. And what those terms really highlight is, discrimination isn't just about individual bias. It's baked into the very structures and systems that we live in.
So it's not just about like changing individual minds, it's about changing the systems themselves. Because otherwise that bias is just going to keep getting replicated.
Exactly. We're talking about the laws, the policies, the way organizations are set up.
Yeah.
We've got to ask ourselves, are these things actually designed in a way that's fair, that promotes equity, or are they accidentally, making things worse? Are they perpetuating inequality without even meaning to?
Right. Like even a law that seems totally neutral on the surface could still have a totally different impact on different groups of people if it's built on this foundation that's already uneven.
Exactly. It's like you can't just look at the surface, you got to look at the whole context. And the other thing we can't forget about is, social norms, the power of those unspoken rules that everyone kind of just follows. Ekerloff and Cranton's work from back in 2000, they really went deep on this.
It's something I've always found fascinating, just how much we humans are influenced
Yeah.
by what other people are doing, what we think other people expect of us. Like we make decisions all the time, not even because we think it's the right decision, but just because that's how it's always been done, or because we're worried about what people will think of us if we do something different.
And that kind of pressure, it can be really powerful, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It can either reinforce these discriminatory behaviors or it can actually help to break them down. Like it's considered totally normal, totally acceptable to discriminate against a certain group. People are more likely to go along with it, even if deep down they know it's wrong.
It's like that classic experiment where they had people look at different lines,
Yeah.
and say which one was the longest. And when everyone else in the group gave the obviously wrong answer,
All right, right.
most people just went along with it, even though they could see with their own eyes that it was wrong.
Yeah.
Just the pressure to conform was that strong.
Exactly. Shows you how much we crave that social acceptance, even if it means ignoring our own better judgment. But the flip side of that is, if you can shift those social norms, if you can make it unacceptable to discriminate,
Right.
then that same social pressure starts to work in favor of equality. It's like flipping a switch.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah.
So, okay, big picture time, because this has been a lot to digest. Where does all this leave us? I mean, what are the big key takeaways you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the biggest thing is, discrimination. It's not always this deliberate, malicious thing. It's usually way more complicated than that, way more nuanced.
Way more insidious even.
Exactly. It's about the systems we build, the information we have access to, and the information we don't. It's the choices we make when we're not even sure what the right answer is, and it's the incredibly powerful but often invisible influence of social norms. All of that factors in.
It's almost like comforting in a way to know it's not always about straight up malice, but it's also kind of terrifying when you realize how much of it really is about the mechanics, like how subtle it can be.
Oh, for sure. But, the good news is once you understand the mechanics, you can start to actually, tinker with them. You can start to change them.
Oh, 100%. That's what I was just thinking about. This whole conversation has really shifted something for me in that it's not enough to just call out individual acts of discrimination.
Yeah.
We've really got to zoom out, look at the whole system.
Yes, 100%. We have to ask, who designed these systems in the first place?
Right.
What assumptions did they build into these systems? And I think even more importantly, whose voices were missing, whose perspectives weren't considered when these decisions were being made. Because if we're not careful, we end up with those situations like you were saying before, where we have algorithms that are in theory supposed to be neutral, totally objective, but they end up actually reinforcing bias because the data they were trained on was biased to begin with.
Garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Exactly. And that's why, diversity, it's not just some like nice to have. It is absolutely essential. And it's not just about, checking boxes and having people who look different in the room. It's about having different ways of thinking, different experiences, different perspectives represented. You need those different voices to be like, hey, did you think about this? Did we miss something here?
Like having a really, really good editor for your code. You know what I mean? They can spot the errors you would never see on your own.
Perfect analogy. And, just like with code, sometimes it's not enough to just tweak a few lines. Sometimes you need to go back to the beginning and rewrite the whole system.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really all comes back to awareness, huh? Once you start to see those subtle ways that discrimination pops up, in those little everyday systems, those little interactions, you can't unsee it.
Nope, you can't. But, that awareness, that's what gives us the power to change things.
So where do we go from here? What are some practical steps that our listener can take to be part of that change?
Well, I always say the first step is you got to start with yourself. Look inward a little bit. Notice your own biases, because we all have them. We all make assumptions about people based on, whatever group we think they belong to. Pay attention to that. Challenge yourself a little bit.
That's harder than it sounds, though, right? Our brains love a shortcut.
They do, they do. But it's like anything else. The more you practice noticing those little shortcuts, the better you get at it. And, it's not just about those little individual actions either. We've got to think bigger. We have to push for change on a systemic level, whether that's, getting involved in advocating for policy changes, supporting organizations that are on the ground doing the work, or even just honestly starting those conversations in your own life with your friends, your family, even if they're a little uncomfortable.
It's about all of us working together, right?
Mm-hmm.
It takes policymakers, educators, business leaders, everybody to really build a world that's more equitable.
It does. It's a team effort.
Could not agree more.
Yeah.
Well, this has been, I'm not going to lie, kind of an intense but really, really eye-opening deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about, the complexities of discrimination, but about the power we all have to be a part of building something better.
Me too. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. We're never going to get to a place where discrimination just like POOF disappears overnight. But we can't let that get us down or make us feel hopeless. Every single step, no matter how small, that we take toward greater equity, greater inclusion, it makes a difference. It moves us in the right direction.
I love that. So well said. And to everyone listening, thank you, as always, for coming along with us on this little journey of discovery. Keep those curious minds of yours engaged. Keep thinking critically about the world around you, and keep sending us those awesome deep dive requests. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and keep those conversations going.